Hi, welcome back to World History by a Jew. I'm your lecturer, Seth Fleishman. We're now moving on to part G of our Samson Mysteries. Wow, can you believe part G? Okay, so this one's also going to be a change. So our last lecture, we were focusing very much into a biblical analysis. This time, we're going to jump into the archaeology. So we're going to look to see what the archaeology can tell us relative to the biblical story. Does the archaeology back up what we read in the Bible? Can it back up what we read in the Bible? What can we use what can we use from this archaeology to further our study or perhaps disprove our study? Not everything fits exactly the way you would necessarily want it to. All right, let's get started. I wanted to dedicate this lecture to one individual, and that is Herschel Shanks, who just passed away. He was a giant in the world of biblical archaeology. He was a lawyer by training, but he ended up becoming the founder and publisher of Biblical Archaeology Review, which is a magazine that you see referenced a lot of times in my lectures. In fact, I don't know if this series would even be possible without him. So he understand he passed away last month due to coronavirus, and I've had a couple lectures come out since then, but I wanted to save it for when I had content that was more from his work. So we'll give Herschel a thanks tonight for his efforts, and you'll see the results of what he's done over the years and what it allows me to do for all of you. All right, we're going to start off the material tonight with the map. I just want to make sure everyone knows where we are. We have been focused on the Eastern Mediterranean in the last few lectures. Now, this one is going to be focused on exclusively Israel. So let me bring up my little red square here. So we're about to zoom in. So this red rectangle is going to be blown up for you. And there we go. So there's modern Israel plus a little bit more for you. And now I need to zoom in one more time. So we're going to take where this blue rectangle is. I'm not just going to zoom in. I'm also going to go back in time. Okay, so here's this right here is the blue space on the map. And now I've gone back to let you see what the map would look like during King Saul's era. Our map at the right here is our famous map that we've looked at in many of our lectures. And we've been studying each of the peoples that fill in these places on the map. So if you want to know about each of them, I have the lecture number referenced here. Feel free to check it out on my YouTube channel. But tonight we are focusing on the tribe of Dan. And as we've talked about from the scripture, the tribe of Dan's original place of inheritance was right here around Jaffa, around Tel Aviv. Okay, but what makes the tribe of Dan unusual is their territory moved. They moved from Jaffa, from the area of Tel Aviv, way up here to the far north, and they founded the city of Dan, which is an archaeological site called Tel Dan now. So because the tribe of Dan is split into two places, our archaeological investigation is also going to be split to different cities. So let me show you another map here. These are our two locations we're going to be studying. The red arrows point them out. We're going to look at Tel Kasila, and then we're going to look at Dan. So Tel Kasila is very close to Tel Aviv. I'm going to show you exactly how close in just a minute. So let's do that first, and then we'll talk about Dan. This photo, which I think is a great view, you see the coast of Israel. So this is looking towards the north. Okay, so we're looking up the coast here. South is down here, north is up here. And first we run into Jaffa, and then you can see Jaffa, the old city of Jaffa runs right into the new modern city of Tel Aviv. They're really connected to each other. Now, I'm going to show you another picture a little bit further up the coast. You see right here, I just want you to look right here, there's a rock right off that pier. Okay, so hang tight. That's a very famous rock. So see, here's the harbor I just showed you, and then here's the rock I was trying to point out at the end. So it's just a little further up. Of course, we're changing the angle, but a little bit further north and changing the angle a bit. And this is Andromeda's rock. And I wanted to just point out that Andromeda's rock is here before we move on. Why am I talking about the Greeks? Well, Andromeda was, for those of you not as familiar with Greek mythology, Andromeda was the daughter of the king of the Ethiopians, and she was bound, I don't want to get into too many details here, but just short version, she was bound to this rock here right off the coast of Jaffa. And she, our hero of the day is Perseus. So Perseus is returning from slaying Medusa, yes, that Medusa with the snake hair, and he sees Andromeda and he rescues her from this rock, from a sea monster, like sea monster is about to devour her, and he rescues her from the rock. Now, what makes Perseus interesting is he's actually not, we always say a Greek hero, he's actually known to be associated with the Danaoi, right? He was from the Greek, he was a Danaoi hero, from, to be very specific, and this connects this Danaoi hero right here with Jaffa. Just a nice little detail before I move on. Okay, that's enough of our Greek mythology for tonight. Let's move back into our Jewish studies, right? Let me move that map out. Now, I want you to look again, same map here. We're looking at this map of Jaffa and Tel Aviv, and we're gonna add to the next slide up the coast. Okay, so Jaffa, Tel Aviv, and then this right here, now you're looking a little bit further up, and you've got Tel Aviv here towards the right of this picture. The picture on the left, you have Tel Aviv towards the right, and then you see this Yarkon River. This is going to be very important for us for a minute. This Yarkon River is flowing into the Mediterranean. And then here's Tel Kasila. That's where our archaeological investigation is going to be. But I'm also going to show you on Google Maps here. For those of you very familiar with Israel, I think you'll enjoy this a little bit. This right here is our map of the Tel Aviv Jaffa area, Tel Aviv Jaffa. And now I'm going to focus in on this green rectangle. By the way, I've stayed at this Hilton before. It was a great weekend. Really enjoyed it. Recommend it. But anyway, this green rectangle here is going to be our next zoom in. Oops. And now you see this purple rectangle, and I want to zoom in there a little bit more. But before I do that, just notice how the Yarkon River here is flowing into the Mediterranean, right? And then you have this park in the area. So there's the Palmach Museum. We have the Yitzhak Rabin Center. You have the Eretz Israel Museum. It's all around here. And this is the area that Tel Kasila is as well. Okay, so let's take a look at Tel Kasila. Here it is in the archaeological dig. So I've now zoomed in again. See, my purple rectangle is now much larger, and you can see exactly where Tel Kasila is. Here's the Yarkon River. Here's the Eretz Israel Museum that I just mentioned. And now let's switch back to a photograph. So there's a photograph of the archaeological site. It is really amazing. You have this site, I mean, just look at it. You don't have to be an expert to be like, wow, you have this site right in the middle of Tel Aviv, like at a park in Tel Aviv, you have something like this. That's one of the, this is just one of those aspects that makes Israel so amazing. Okay, so let's take a look at this archaeological site to see what we can get. Now, let me remind you, this archaeological site is right in the region that has been associated with the tribe of Dan. What do we know about Tel Kasila? Okay, so as I said, it's within the city limits of Tel Aviv, and it's at the mouth of the Yarkon River. It forms this great inner harbor from the Mediterranean, right? Because if you're building on the Mediterranean, then you have to deal with, say, the weather patterns in the Mediterranean. You have to deal with invaders coming in from the Mediterranean. By being on this river just a little bit into the coastline, it protects you both against nature and humans to a certain extent. It was built on virgin land shortly after 1200 BCE, and is widely, universally, everyone accepts that it was what we call a Philistine city. Now, when I say Philistine, as we've learned in our previous lectures, that does not necessarily mean Philistine proper, but it does seem to be these groups of sea peoples, right? It's not necessarily Peliset, but it's these groups of sea peoples that settled into the land of Canaan. But it eventually, after a couple hundred years, was annexed by Israel, either under King David or King Solomon. You see both sides of it. Either way, just know under the United Monarchy, it became part of the kingdom of Israel. Now let's take a look at what the archaeology gives us. What makes Tel Kasila interesting is this, well, there's multiple things, but what makes it particularly interesting to most people and to us is this temple area with the residential quarter. And it shows us 3 levels of Philistine occupation, which I'll get to in just a minute. Just bear with me. The most amazing aspect, of course, is this Philistine temple. And it was a huge, huge deal. It was the first Philistine temple ever found and excavated. Okay, so major, major deal in archaeology. It also has an administrative complex with a hearth. And I want to get into the temple, but before I get into the temple, I want to mention this hearth, because this hearth is very interesting to us as well. So what do we know about Tel Kasile's hearth? So there's a large hall with benches, and this drawing right here gives you an idea. That's the hearth right there. Okay, so you have this like large community center, ceremonial hall, and you have this freestanding hearth in the center. It's a elliptical brick hearth, and it's got this depression for the fire. I think it's a good drawing to give you an idea of what it looked like. What makes a hearth, you're like, what's the big deal, Seth? It's a hearth. Well, what makes a hearth interesting is this is not native to the land of Canaan. You did not, Canaanites, Israelites didn't build hearths. Why is that? Well, it's really, a hearth is central to a colder climate, because when you have real winters, when you have cold winters, everyone gathers around the hearth. And I think you can imagine it's like the way we think of gathering around a campfire, right? Everyone's around the hearth to stay warm, and they tell stories and they bond, and it becomes part of the community, this hearth. And so you can see how it fits to have a hearth inside of a community center. But what makes it interesting to us is, of course, that it's not native. It means whoever built this community center at the hearth was someone who was not Israelite, who was not Canaanite. But it is very common to find a hearth in Cyprus and Crete, and really in the Aegean world in general, right? Greece can have a pretty cold winter, and so hearth is quite a common find in that part of the world. Okay, now think hearth, and we're going to have a fun little exercise in etymology. Was it that Peliset became Philistine, or was it Philistine became Peliset? We normally think of it as the real name was Peliset, and then the Greeks took it and corrupted it to Philistine, which was then taken over by the Romans, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's how we normally think about it. But what if it was the other way around? What if it was an Indo-European word, a archaic Greek, but an Indo-European word that was Philistine, and it became Peliset, which then carried on to be Philistine again? Now, if that's the case, you can break up Philistine into two Indo-European words, into phile, which means tribe, into hesti, which means hearth. Okay, so Philistine becomes Philahesti. I should actually say, by the way, it's really the goddess of the hearth, not hearth exactly, but you get my point. So you can say Philahesti means, which is Philistine, really means the tribe of the hearth, which is great because in archaeology, right, what you can find to associate with a Philistine community center is the hearth. So it makes a lot of sense. Now, whether it's true or not, you're going to hear both sides of the equation. If you want to read about it in detail, that's source number 3 here. But anyway, I thought it was too fun of a detail to skip over, but I didn't get into hearths when I did the Philistine lecture. I've been waiting to bring this up. So here it is. Gives you something to think about. There's another aspect this hearth concept should give you. So we're going to have a flashback. Ready for another flashback? We don't have to go too far. This was when we studied the lecture entitled Samson's Synagogue. We visited the city of Mopsuestia. So Mopsuestia is also 2 words. It's Mopsus and Hestia, right? So if Philistia can be tribe of the hearth, well, Mophestia can be the hearth of Mopsus. So here we have another hearth connection, and it connects to a people we've been studying. And I just thought anyway, it's fun. Gives you something to think about. Okay, actually, as much as I like talking about the hearth, that's not what we're here for. We're really actually talking about the temple. Okay, so let's take a look at this temple. Well, as I said, the temple at Tel Kasila was a huge deal when it was found. It was the first Philistine temple ever to be excavated. Okay. Now, there are 3 levels. There's Stratum 12, which is the oldest, and then 11, and then 10. Now, the oldest level, and this, by the way, this drawing you see here is of the oldest level. This oldest level is just a small single room temple, which you can get this. This was a great reconstruction here to give you an idea of what it looked like. It was made of mud brick with plaster covered walls. There were benches along the side made of mud brick. All these details are going to come back later, so just kind of have them in the back of your head. All right. the most noticeable aspect of it, is this raised platform. So in the corner, so the bema, which is kind of a raised holy platform. You'll see a bema in synagogues today, but it's not in the corner of the room. So what makes this stand out, this Philistine temple, is here in this corner, you have the bema. And behind that bema was probably an area for storing cult objects. And some cult items have been found there. And I want to point out a couple of these cultic objects for you here because they're going to be important later on in this lecture. One is this little duck bowl. So this is like a libation bowl that was found at Tel Kasila. And then they have these stands, these cultic stands, and you can see how the bowls could fit over the stands. Here's kind of a nicer stand that there's no bowl here, but you can see the stand by itself. But you can just see how it fits together. And like I said, just take a mental note of it. We're going to come back to it. Now what I want to do is take a closer look at this temple. Okay, so look down here on the bottom left. I'm going to move us on to the next slide. Let's get back to our story of Samson. At a festival for the Philistines, they called for Samson. At this point, Samson had been captured. He had been blinded. His hair had been cut. He had no more powers. So the Philistines brought him out to dance for them and entertain them. He's now powerless, remember, and they put him up against the pillars inside the temple, and there's thousands of Philistines there, including balanced on the roof, watching Samson dance. And Samson called to Hashem, and he begged Hashem to give him strength one more time so he can have revenge on these Philistines. And Samson and Hashem heard Samson's cry, and Samson regained his strength and cried, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he pulled these columns in, and when he did that, the whole roof collapsed and the whole temple structure came down, killing Samson and the Philistines that were there. Now, with that being said, I want you to look at these two pillars right here. You see this individual standing in between the two pillars? Look at this drawing here of Samson tearing down the temple. Now, let's talk about these pillars. What are we looking at? First of all, are we looking at the same temple? No, because we know that this temple that Samson destroyed was in Gaza, and we're at Tel Kasila near Jaffa. We're not in Gaza, but nonetheless, it works perfectly with this story. So if the temple in Gaza had the same design, and this two-pillar structure is accounted for in archaeology as being a temple of the Aegean, then if he were to pull these two columns down, again, which would be a normal design for these small temples, it would bring the entire roof down. So these are, of course, the Samson pillars. If you go to the site, I'm sure everyone wants to go stand here and take a picture. Like I said, it's not Gaza, but it's amazing how well this actual temple from the same era of Samson works perfectly with the story. That was fun. Now, I want to show one other thing to you. Now, this is my observation. Like I said, this is a tourist attraction on the bottom left here. I'm far from the only person to notice it. But I was looking at this stand, and if you read the official description of the stand, it says a stand with people dancing in the windows. But it occurs to me, these temples didn't have big windows, but they did have big columns. So instead of someone dancing in the windows, I would argue that this stand is actually showing people dancing between the columns, right? Makes a lot more sense than windows that didn't exist that size. So this, again, looks about like it would look like if you look here at this stand and then you look here at a man in between the columns. Anyway, it's fun, but that's actually not the most famous thing found at Tel Kasila. That's right. I'm going to go up one more level and show you something that does not have to do with our lecture tonight, but it is going to come up in a future lecture, and I cannot move past Tel Kasila without mentioning it. There was an ostracon found at Tel Kasila that says gold from Ophir to Beit Haran, 30 shekels. Okay, so this is an ostracon with it's basically a shipping document, right? It's like a business transaction, a business shipping document talking about 30 shekels of Ophir gold. And it was on its way to Beit Haran, which was a town on the way from Tel Kasila to Jerusalem. All right. Now, the reason this was such a big deal in biblical archaeology is many, many times in the Bible, Ophir gold is mentioned, but no one knows exactly where Ophir is. I do want to talk about that sometime, but not tonight. No one knows exactly where Ophir is, but over and over again, this is just a very partial listing of how many times Ophir gold is listed in the Bible. This is the first and only archaeological evidence we have of Ophir gold actually existing. Huge deal. Okay, so let me summarize what we've learned so far. Our proposal is that the tribe of Danites may have been this Stratum 12, and then the Philistines took over in Stratum 11. Why am I saying that? Okay, what stands out? Okay, we know people from the Aegean seemed to settle Jaffa shortly after 1200 BCE, but they had very short-lived existence before the more traditional Philistine culture moved in. Now, first of all, why would they come and build a port on virgin land? If it was the same Philistines that were here, right? They've got Ashkelon. And if it's up here, if it's the Jeker instead of the Philistines, well, they have Dor, so they already have a port. So both of these people already have major ports. Why build a brand new port on virgin land unless maybe you're another people trying to establish yourself? Now, this Stratum 12, this first stratum, clearly shows an Aegean influence. All right, we have the temple, the pottery is Aegean, you have the hearth, that's definitely not Canaanite. But then Stratum 12 is destroyed after a few decades. Okay, so after what, 30, 40, 50 years, Stratum 12 is destroyed, but it's replaced with more Philistine culture. But this is the traditional Philistine culture. This is the Philistine culture from Philistia. All right. Now, Stratum 11 has been dated to around the same time of Tiglath-Pileser's conquering of Sidon. So Sidon, of course, is way up here. Now, this is relevant because we know from the Bible that Dan was right up here, was under the control of the Sidonians, but the Sidonians could not come to Dan's aid right at around the same time that Stratum 12 switched to Stratum 11. Why couldn't Sidon come to Dan's aid? Well, because they were being defeated by the Assyrians, by Tiglath-Pileser and his Assyrian army. So the timing works great here, is my point. And this really connects to the section, to our biblical section of this aspect. So if you haven't seen that one about the biblical quotes, you definitely want to see that, and this will make a lot more sense to you. So my point in all this is Stratum 12, the earliest stratum of Tel Kasila, is Philistine-like, but yet it's different. Okay, so now I want to drill a little bit more into the details here, right? The devil is in the details. In Stratum 12, we have walls of mud brick on bedrock, but without stone foundations, right? You just have the mud brick and then the bedrock. But the future layers of Philistines, they wanted a stone foundation. So that shows you a slight difference, okay? Let's mention another one. Stratum 12 was intentionally torn down. Okay, so the whole town was destroyed, but the people who rebuilt it were Philistines. So if it was already the Philistines that were there, they're not going to tear down their entire old town and rebuild it. All right, it's another interesting detail. Now the pottery also is very similar but different. And this, I could not find a great picture to show you. And what I'll have to say is if you're into pottery and you want to read about it, then this is a great source. Just number one right here, and then it'll tell you what the differences were. But just trust me, for our purposes tonight, the pottery does look to be of Aegean origin, but it does look different. And then finally, this initial settlement lasted 50 years. And I talked about how this, whether it was 30 or 40 or 50 or even 60 years, whatever it is in this range, there was a clear short period of a people and then a changeover. Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize this in about a sentence. 2 sentences. In short, other sea peoples, not Philistines, initially created this settlement at Tel Kasila, but they would flee encroachment by the Philistines proper, the Philistines of Philistia. And these Philistines of Philistia dominated the area until King David and King Solomon's time. Existence of other sea peoples does not prove these were Danites, but it does prove a changeover of people with odd cultural similarities, yet differences. All right, let me go back to my main maps here. Okay, now that was part 1 of our archaeology. Now let's move on to part 2. We talked about Tel Kasila. Now it's time to head to Tel Dan. All right, let's go back to our Google Maps. Here is our Google Maps, and we're driving. See, I even did your little directions here. We're driving here from Tel Kasila, and we're heading way up here to Tel Dan, where it's labeled Tel Dan Nature Preserve, which I'll explain in 1 minute. Here is our purple rectangle that I'm going to zoom in on. Ta-da! Okay, now we're now zoomed in on Tel Dan, but I want to point out a couple things to you before I move from this map. Look at Tyre, and Sidon would be right up here. Okay, so the Sidonian territory was up here. You have Tyre here, and you have Damascus here. So Tel Dan is this great central location between these major ancient cities of antiquity. All right, now let me switch to the satellite version of this. Okay, here's the satellite version of this, and I zoomed in a little bit more, but here's the Tel Dan Nature Reserve via satellite. This is a great example of one of the many things that makes Israel interesting. If you just look at how much is labeled on this map in this little bit of territory, right? So we have the Israeli-Syrian armistice line, and right along the border of that, we have this great nature preserve. You have the Israel National Trail, but right outside of that, you have these farms. And look at the efficiency of the territory here with these farms. You even have a fish farm down here, right? And then you have the Dan River running through it. The Dan River is a major tributary of the Jordan River. Now, why this is called the Tel Dan Nature Reserve is it actually serves a dual role, that it's an archaeological site, but it's also this great nature park. And I've been there myself, and I can tell you it's a wonderful place to take the family for a day. Now, let's get on to our archaeology. And obviously I can't use this picture because it's so lush and so green and so beautiful. You can't get a good archaeological picture from a satellite. Okay, just a quick note on the geography. You have this beautiful picture here. So here's Mount Hermon, which is the tallest mountain at the Golan Heights. And you can see Tel Dan has built kind of this very fertile valley just right off of the mountain. Now, there is natural springs running through here. So there's a underground water source, a very high quality underground water source, which also makes for that great nature preserve that I mentioned. And as I showed you on the map, it's got this great central location between Tyre and Damascus. So it was first, the city was first known as Laish, which I mentioned when we're going through the biblical aspect of it. And what's interesting about Laish is it's actually an old name for an old word for a lion. Okay, so that could and it doesn't, this is just a fun fact, it's not important to our lecture, but it could make the Deuteronomy chapter 33:22 make a lot of sense when it says Dan is a lion's whelp that leaps forth from the Bashan. Bashan's up here way in the north, and a lion leaping from the north, and the original city's name before the tribe of Dan took it over was equated to a lion. Anyway, just a fun detail. But then here, this next verse you've seen before, this is just where I talk about how the tribe of Dan takes it over and renames the town as Laish. Now, I want to get into the history. There is long history in this town. So long, the settlement is probably over 5,000 years old. Okay, so that's a lot of history. And there was already fortifications, like strong fortifications, going back to the early Bronze Age. So we'll say 4,500 years or so, give or take a couple centuries. We already have strong fortifications in this town. In the Middle Bronze Age, those strong fortifications become massive fortifications. And most impressive is this gate, this Middle Bronze Age gate that's been excavated at Tel Dan. It's dated to around the 1700s BCE, and it has the earliest intact arches standing anywhere in the world. The earliest intact arches standing anywhere in the world. There's 3 of them, actually. Now, in terms of documentation, the Egyptians, also around the same time this gate is being built. So obviously things were happening in this town around there in the 1700s BCE. We have these excavation texts from Egypt. Let me explain that. So the Egyptians had this way of cursing their enemies if they were taking over an area or they wanted to take over an area. They'd write the name of all these places on a piece of pottery, and then they'd smash the pottery, okay, to symbolically say that they were conquering these people or they were going to conquer these people. So anyway, the earliest written texts that we have from Egypt is these execration texts dated to the 1700s, where they claim that they're conquering or going to conquer Laish. Then around the same time, we have the Mari archive. Now, when I do my series on Mesopotamia, we're going to talk a lot about Mari. And those of you who've seen the little bit I've done on it know I'm a big fan of Mari. But anyway, in the Mari archive, which are this huge cache of cuneiform documents, Laish is also mentioned, thanks to Zimri Lim. Moving on to the late Bronze Age, the city was very prosperous. And this is where you really saw this key trading route idea come in between Tyre and Damascus. So we have this major trading stop here at Laish. And the biggest find related to the late Bronze Age was a Mycenaean tomb, which the neutron analysis actually showed that the items in the tomb probably came from the Archelid, from the area of Argos, which is another interesting detail for those of you who've been following these lectures. But nonetheless, Laish didn't have everything going its way, for it was conquered by Thutmose III. This is the Napoleon of pharaohs. He has a whole lecture that I did about him. But anyway, Thutmose III did claim to conquer Laish. That would be circa 1469 BCE. Now, the city seemed to go down at some point, and then we had this huge changeover as the Iron Age began shortly after 1200 BCE. There was a significant change of settlement, and this is when the biblical record is recording that Laish became Dan. I've mentioned a lot of archaeological finds, but all pale in comparison to the next one. I want to show you something that really does not have any bearing on our lecture tonight, but you could argue it's the greatest archaeological discovery ever in biblical archaeology, and it was discovered at Tel Dan. And this was the Tel Dan Stele. Now, this was a huge deal. There is no way I can understate how big of a deal this was. Okay, so I want to talk about it for just a minute, even though it doesn't have anything to do with our lecture tonight. I just want you to know about it, and I'm sure it'll eventually come up again in a future lecture, just nothing anytime soon that I'm aware of. So the Tel Dan Stele has been dated to around 800s BCE, and it's just a 13-line inscription, and it's written in early Aramaic, so kind of like the script is like been labeled by the experts as Paleo Hebrew. It's got 2 clear, concise phrases. The first is how, and by the way, you have the writing here if you want to see it, but the first is House of David, okay? This was huge. Until this was discovered, there had never been any archaeological proof that there ever was a David. Zero, zip, nada. So you can imagine before this discovery, which was only 30 years ago or so, the biblical minimalists were like, you know, this King David guy never even existed. So it was a major deal when it was discovered. Our first evidence of King David outside the Bible. Even better, we get another great phrase, King of Israel. This was the oldest extra-biblical reference to Israel. So wow, you get this double whammy in one discovery. But the funny part about it was actually a bad thing in a sense. It was a victory stele erected by an Aramean king against the kingdoms of Israel / Judah, against the Israelites. So the guess by the experts is it may have been the Aramean king Ben-Hadad, who is recorded in 2 Chronicles of conquering King Baasha of Israel around this time. So around 85 BCE, it makes sense, historically speaking, from what we know. Whether it is or isn't, amazing. Now, the Israelites would eventually reconquer Don, and when they did, they broke the stela down and it became part of a wall in the city, and that's how archaeologists found it. They found it still the remains of this wall. Okay, I'm like way off course now, but I couldn't do Tel Dan without mentioning this particular find. Okay, let's get back to our subject at hand. Now, what I want to look at is what happened in the archaeological record that backs up this concept that Laish became Don, that there was some changeover. Now, our stratum numbers are different because remember, our stratum numbers are relative to each archaeological site. So when we're dealing with 12, 11, and 10 at Tel Kasila, when we get to Don, we're really looking at stratum 7, 6, and 5. Okay. Now, so 7 is considered to be the late Bronze Age, which then ended with destruction. Okay, stratum 6 is proposed to be the settlement of Don. When Laish became Don is proposed to be this stratum 6, and this dating looks something about this changeover looks to be somewhere around 1150 to 1100 BCE, which works with all the other dates we've gone through. So what makes this stand out is it's characterized by tents and storage pits. So what is it? This stratum 6, when it replaced stratum 7, so stratum 7 is our late Bronze Age, this great trading center ends, and it's a downgrade because this great city, this urban civilization becomes characterized by a bunch of tents and grain storage pits. So that's kind of interesting that it would go backward, so to speak, which would indicate that it's a different people, that it's a different civilization that moved in, significantly different civilization, that different group of people that moved in. Looking at the pottery record, if you look at stratums 6 and 5, so stratum 5 would be the next one. So let's look at stratum 6 as being people in tents moving into Tel Dan, and then stratum 5 would be those people, those tent people now have settled and they're building permanent structures and all that. Just trying to put it in simple terms here. Okay, so looking at the pottery thereof, there was a changeover. Now, there was always Aegean looking pottery there before and after, but certainly there was a changeover in the pottery, the quality of the pottery. The Sidonian pottery was greatly reduced, for example, but like I said, you still find some Aegean pottery there. The Pythoi tell the best story because these Pythoi, well, actually, you know what? Let me do another flashback. So I want you to look up here. See this picture of these Pythoi? We talked about Pythoi in detail when I did the Philistine lecture. So if you want to go back and check out lecture 11, I really go through each of these and explain how to tell the difference between the two. But what I want to focus on these is the Israelite ones. And the Israelite ones have this collared rim. Okay, see the collared rim? It's a little bit different than the other rims, and it really, that's what makes it stand out. Let me zoom in on that. Here's, see how it's got kind of this squared off part to this collared rim? Okay, so that's our collared rim. Now I want to go back to the slide so you see. Okay, so here's our Pythoi from Tel Dan. You can see this collared rim. So these would be identified as Israelite Pythoi. And there are similar ones found at Hazor, at Beit Shayan, at Afula. Notice I didn't say at Tel Kasila, but this is a Israelite technology. It would imply, if these are Danites arriving, if they were these tent people, that they were taking on Israelite traits as they went through the hill country. Now this works because remember, in the biblical story, we know that both the spies went to the hill country and stayed a while, and then the people went, when all the tribe of Dan, as we're told in Judges, went up north to found Tel Dan, they went through the hill country. So this is going to be picking up technology from the hill country. Now, the amphora is another one I wanted to show you because this one does have a comparison to Tel Kasila. So some of these smaller items that they could carry with them do compare to Tel Kasila, but not just there. So Megiddo too has it, right? Megiddo has a mix of a bunch of places, but then we have the craters. Now these craters are for mixing wine, right? So these are very important. If you want to dilute your wine a little bit, you got to have a crater to mix it in. And again, the craters that we found that were found at Tel Dan were comparable to Tel Kasila, but other places as well. It wasn't just Tel Kasila. So it's not like open and shut, right? That everything matches Tel Kasila or nothing matches Tel Kasila, but it definitely had, there's some unique finds that match the two, but other places as well. All right, I don't want to make it sound much more than it was. There's much more to the story. And if you want to see the pottery, there is a great book that just came out last year. That's source number 2. If you want to know about the Pithaway, I think the best source I used was number 1, if you just want to look at the Pithaway specifically. But if you want to look at all the pottery, this book that just came out last year, it goes into great detail with it, and I highly recommend it. Okay, now let me try to shorten all this information that I gave you, and that is, would the same people who lived through the urban success and civilization at Tel Dan, this high level of civilization during the late Bronze Age, revert to living in tents with storage pits afterwards? Obviously not. They're not going to go backwards in technology, but we know someone who has, right? If you I'll remind you of these couple verses I mentioned before, the Camp of Dan between Zor and Eshtaol. This is why the place is called the Camp of Dan to this day. These people lived in a camp. So we do know someone who moved into the area from, as the scripture tells us, around this time, and they lived in a camp. And the archaeology clearly shows that these people who came in lived in a camp. We don't have any other city that we could say would be equivalent. So this is a unique situation. Now I want to get a little bit more specific, and I want to show you something familiar but different that we talked about with Tel Kasila. You remember our bird bowl, right? See this? So this one is actually found at Tel Dan. You see the bird head here? You can see it says bird bowl heads found at Tel Dan. Okay, now let's look at the Tel Kasila one. So you see we have the same design, the same bird bowl that was found at Tel Dan that matches the same design we see at Tel Kasila. And again, just as a reminder, you can see it goes on these cult stands, or probably went on these cult stands. So this is a very unique find. There's not a lot of them out there, particularly in what the territory that became the Kingdom of Israel, the United Monarchy. But here we have it at these two unique cities, Tel Dan and Tel Kasila. But that's not the main thing. What I really want you to ask is, where was the bird bowl found? And the answer is that, like at Tel Kasila, this bird bowl, or the remnants of it, was found in a small rectangular room with a very familiar design at Tel Dan. Let's look at this small rectangular room. So wouldn't you know, there is an Aegean temple at Tel Dan as well. And this has been published really within the last 5 years. This is fairly recent information. So you have a small rectangular building for cultic purposes. It's got this bema in the corner, right? And these cold objects were actually found within the realm of the bema, which is great. So you actually, here's the actual items that were here. I mean, this reconstruction is great to look at, right? You have mud brick benches against the walls, which ring a bell. And this was built circa late 1100 BCE, so closer to 1100 BCE as opposed to 1150 BCE. We have a similar design in Cyprus. In fact, there's two of these found in Cyprus with a similar design. There's even one found in Milos, so way in the Aegean. But of course, what this is most comparable to is only one location in Israel, and that is Tel Kasila. All right, so we found one others, and this one's smaller, by the way, than the Tel Kasila one. Notice you don't need pillars to support the wall, but nonetheless, this comparable design was only found in one other place, and that's Tel Kasila. Now I'm going to compare them side by side for you. Okay, so the bottom one is Tel Dan, which I just showed you, and then the top one is Tel Kasila, which we talked about earlier. Now you can see, okay, like I said, this one's bigger, but you ignore those very important columns, and you see the similarity is striking. And then here's the two floor plans to compare the floor plans. Now this one is bigger, so it's got a little bit of storage space in the back, but basically your design is a very, very similar. Is it the same? Did the same people build it? Maybe there was a changeover. If this were the Danites and they left Tel Kasila, they came to Tel Dan, maybe some of them didn't want to go all the way with the Israelite culture, so they built a smaller temple there at Tel Dan as they were familiarizing themselves with the Israelite religion. It's definitely a remarkable similarity between the two, and to find them at these two locations and know they're built around the same time, and to have those bird bowls and have the same building techniques with these mud bricks kind of stand out. And okay, gives you something to think about, right? At least gives you something to think about, if nothing else. Okay. There is a lot more about Tel Kasila and Tel Dan. I cut over so much, especially with Tel Dan. I already know someone's going to ask me why I didn't mention the golden calf and how you had a temple there at Tel Shiloh and it was destroyed. Anyway, there's just so much information. I didn't want to go too far off track. So I let myself have two little detours at each of the locations. But you know what? If you want to know more, all my sources are on here. Please, please read more. And I'm sure I will come back, especially to Tel Dan again at a future date. Let me go back to our map here. I want to wrap us up. So looking at the archaeological picture along with the scripture, we get a pretty good feel for how the archaeology can back up what we see in the scripture, particularly with the changeover at Tel Dan, right? Tel Kasila, there's a little bit more, but if you look at it as these people who are not quite Israelite, even according to the scripture, who we don't really even know their full genealogy, now first settles here, and then they start traveling up through the hill country. And I told you they picked up some aspects of the culture in this hill country, and then they form a new town here. Well, you could see it happening, right? It's not beyond the realm of possibilities as you analyze this closely. Okay, let's wrap up. First, we have the story of Samson. And Samson is this odd story for a Jewish religious leader, right? Doesn't really sound like a Jewish religious leader at all. But we know Samson's from the tribe of Dan, and the geography of the Samson story puts Dan, the tribe of Dan, around Tel Kasila during Samson's era. So this would be the Tel Aviv area. And the map, of course, fills in the map. I'm going to go back to the map you just saw. And that map, where we place the tribe of Dan, fits in nicely on the coast, right between the sea peoples that we know. We also know Samson regularly interacts with the Philistines in Philistia, and it makes sense when you look on the map compared to the story. All good. But in short, what I really want you to get out of that is, if I have to summarize it, it's the first thing I said, that Samson doesn't really seem like a Jewish religious hero. So whose hero is he? Biblical oddities. Okay, we learned about how in Genesis that the other tribes were instructed by Jacob to treat Dan as one of the tribes. It's just a very odd detail. We have confusing records on Dan's inheritance, right? Did he even have an inheritance? Well, according to Joshua, he did, and he lost it. But according to Judges, he didn't even have one. He had to go find one. We have almost no genealogy on Dan, barely any mention of his descendants, and in one case, no descendants whatsoever in Chronicles. In Judges 5, we get this odd detail about Dan being lingering by his ships like a foreigner when how are these Israelites leaving Egypt and then having these ships? It's weird, right? I know make it sound weird, but it is weird. The Danites were pushed around both by the Amorites and the Philistines, and then the end result of this is going to be this migration of Dan to the north, because of course they're the camp of Dan, and the camp of Dan is on the move. So to summarize this one, I would just say this tribe is different from all the others. Whether you want to say mobility or the connection of the ships or no genealogy, the tribe is different. Okay, now what does Tel Kasila add to it? Tel Kasila, it shows that we had sea peoples found the town, but they were only around for a few decades. And while they looked a lot like the Philistines, they weren't the Philistines. They were different. But they built this new port in between two other ports, one that was controlled by the Philistines proper and the other controlled by the Jeker. So then this occupation is very short. So they built this port and then disappeared a few decades later. They left us a freestanding hearth, which is a very interesting detail when you get into people from the Aegean and particularly Philistine archaeology. And of course, what was the most fun was this distinctive Aegean temple. If I have to give you the short version of this, it's that we had this short-lived settlement that seemed a lot like the Philistines, but yet they were different. And finally, what did we learn from Tel Dan? Tel Dan, we know the timing of this changeover from this more urban civilization to these tent people was close in timing to Tel Kasila. But there was a distinct change of civilization, and these new people were semi-nomadic. They lived in a camp to start with before they settled. They had Aegean ware that was similar to Tel Kasila, but they also brought in other technologies as well from other places like Beit Shean and Afula, definitely not Philistine proper. They then built this distinctive Aegean temple, which is a smaller version of the one we saw at Tel Kasila. Very similar, but smaller. It's just interesting we don't have the comparison anywhere else. I mean, Ekron would be the closest you have to it. Gaza may, by the way, Gaza may, but there you can't do any archaeology in Gaza. The city's completely living on top of its layers still. There's nowhere to go there, archaeologically speaking. So in short, we have Tel Dan. It was settled by migratory people with a clearly transitional culture. They were changing. That was a lot. You have a lot to think about. So we're going to come back in a few days and we're going to wrap all this up. I'm going to take all these lectures, all these parts, A's, B's, and C's, and maybe some other lectures too, pull them all together into one coherent story for you. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to help me out, real quick, just like it. Okay, already getting the likes help. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel. And if you really want to help me out, please share my channel with your friends. More the merrier as far as I'm concerned. Thank you, and I'll see you again real soon.